You remember the exact moment you got your first email address. You also remember a time before email existed. You grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons on a television with an actual dial, and then one day, without much fanfare, the internet just showed up in your house and changed everything. You're not quite a Gen Xer. You're not quite a millennial. You exist in this strange, fascinating in-between space where you carry both worlds inside you simultaneously. And if nobody's ever given you a proper name for that experience, let me offer you one. You're a Xennial. And the psychology of who you are is more complex, more resilient, and more interesting than most generational conversations ever acknowledge. The term Xennial was coined to describe people born roughly between 1976 and 1985, that microgeneration sandwiched between the cynical independence of Gen X and the optimistic connectivity of millennials. But here's what makes Xennials genuinely different. And this is the part most people miss. It's not just about the years you were born. It's about the specific psychological experience of living through a profound technological transformation during your most formative years. You didn't just witness the digital revolution from the outside. You lived through it from the inside, as a child and then as a young adult. And that experience left a very specific imprint on how your brain processes the world. Think about what your childhood actually looked like. You played outside until the streetlights came on. There was no way for your parents to reach you, and you knew it and they knew it. And somehow, everyone survived. You had to be bored, genuinely, deeply, uncomfortably bored, with nothing to do except use your imagination. You built forts out of couch cushions. You made up games. You read books because there was nothing else. And then you became a teenager, and suddenly there was AOL Instant Messenger, and you were up until 2 in the morning talking to people you'd see the next day anyway. And it felt like the future had arrived in your bedroom. That dual experience is everything. Psychologists who study cognitive development talk about the concept of formative experiences, the events and environments that shape your fundamental mental frameworks during childhood and adolescence. For Xennials, those frameworks were built in two completely different technological realities. You have analog roots and digital fluency. You're bilingual in a way that neither Gen X nor millennials quite are. Gen Xers grew up entirely before the digital age, and many adapted to it as adults with varying degrees of success and resistance. Millennials grew up entirely within it, and many struggle to imagine life without constant connectivity. But you remember both, and that memory gives you something rare. Here's where the psychology gets genuinely fascinating. Because you grew up without smartphones, without social media, without the constant external validation of likes and comments and follower counts, your sense of identity was built the old-fashioned way, through experience, through failure, through boredom that forced you to figure out who you were when nobody was watching. Developmental psychologists call this the process of self-concept formation, and it happens most powerfully during childhood and early adolescence. For Xennials, that formation happened in a radical presence. You were physically where you were, mentally where you were. There was no second screen pulling your attention somewhere else. And then the internet arrived, and you adapted. Not because you had to, in the desperate way someone learns a new language in a foreign country, but because you were young enough and curious enough to absorb it naturally. You figured out HTML on GeoCities just for fun. You burned CDs before streaming existed. You navigated the early internet when it was genuinely strange and uncharted, full of weird forums and dial-up screeching and the thrill of connecting with someone on the other side of the world for the first time. You were the beta testers of the digital age, and that experience built a kind of cognitive flexibility that researchers are only beginning to properly study and appreciate. There's a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire and adapt based on new experiences. Younger brains are more plastic, more adaptable, which is exactly why childhood and adolescence are such critical windows for learning. Xennials hit that window at exactly the right moment. Old enough to have built solid analog foundations, young enough to absorb the digital world without the resistance that comes with a fully formed adult brain. The result is a generation that can genuinely function in both modes. You can sit with boredom. You can also navigate a complex digital interface. You can have a deep face-to-face conversation. You can also manage a team remotely across time zones. That's not nothing. That's actually extraordinary. But let's talk about something more tender, because this generation carries a specific kind of psychological weight that doesn't get acknowledged enough.
Xennials entered the workforce and began building adult lives right around the time everything became unstable. The dot-com crash, September 11th, the 2008 financial crisis. You came of age with optimism, grew into adulthood with uncertainty, and then watched the economic ground shift beneath your feet just as you were trying to plant roots. You were old enough to feel all of it deeply, young enough that it reshaped your fundamental assumptions about security, stability, and what it means to build a life.
That's why Xennials often carry this distinctive psychological duality when it comes to hope. On one hand, you have the analog childhood that taught you that things can be simple, that connection is possible without technology, that life has texture and depth beyond the screen. On the other hand, you have this hard-won adult awareness that the world doesn't always reward effort the way you were told it would. You're not cynical exactly, but you're not naively optimistic either. You occupy this middle ground that psychologists might describe as pragmatic hope. You believe things can be better, and you've also learned to prepare for when they aren't. This shows up in a very specific way in how Xennials handle relationships. You grew up making phone calls, actual phone calls, where you had to speak out loud and respond in real time with no chance to edit your words before sending them. You passed notes in class. You had conversations that couldn't be screenshotted. You built friendships through physical presence, shared time, and the kind of vulnerability that comes from being actually seen by another person. And then social media arrived and you adopted it, but something in you always kept a healthy skepticism about it. You use it, but you're rarely fully seduced by it. You post, but you also remember what connection felt like before the post. Research on loneliness and social connection consistently shows that the quality of relationships matters far more than the quantity. Xennials grew up in a training ground for quality connection. You had to invest in people. There was no option to passively consume someone else's highlight reel from a distance. Friendship required showing up, literally and figuratively. That foundation means many Xennials approach relationships with a depth and intentionality that younger generations who grew up performing connection online sometimes struggle to access. There's also something fascinating about how Xennials process nostalgia. For most people, nostalgia is a gentle ache for a past that's gone. For Xennials, it's something more complex, because the past you're nostalgic for isn't just your personal childhood, it's an entire way of being in the world that no longer exists. The experience of being unreachable, the experience of having to be present because there was no alternative, the experience of a world that moved at human speed rather than algorithmic speed. You don't just miss your childhood, you miss a texture of existence that has fundamentally changed. And yet, here's what's remarkable. Most Xennials don't live in that nostalgia. They carry it, yes. They feel it sometimes, usually late at night when the phone is finally down and the house is quiet, and something in them remembers what silence used to feel like, but they don't collapse into it, because that Gen X influence in your psychological DNA gave you something important. A tolerance for disappointment, a capacity to move forward without requiring the world to meet your expectations. You adapt. You always have. That adaptability is perhaps the defining psychological trait of the Xennial experience. Think about everything your generation has had to learn and relearn. New technologies arrived constantly and you absorbed them. Economic systems failed and you rebuilt. Social norms shifted and you navigated them. The very definition of work transformed and you pivoted. You are a generation of constant translation, always finding a way to bridge what was with what is. And if that sounds exhausting, it sometimes is, but it also means you've built a kind of psychological resilience that's genuinely rare. Researchers who study post-traumatic growth, the positive psychological change that can emerge from difficult experiences, have found that people who develop resilience don't do so by avoiding hardship. They do so by moving through it and finding meaning on the other side. Xennials have had ample practice at exactly this. You've moved through enough disruption to know that you can. And that knowledge, that quiet confidence that comes from having survived multiple versions of the world ending and beginning again, that's not something you learn from a book, it's something you earn from living. So if you're a Xennial watching this, here's what I want you to understand.
The in-between space you've always occupied isn't a mistake. It's not a gap, it's a bridge. You are the living proof that human beings can hold complexity without being broken by it, that you can remember a simpler world and still function in a complicated one, that you can value depth and still navigate surface, that you can be both the person who knows how to sit quietly with yourself and the person who can build a life online. That's not confusion, that's integration. And in a world that keeps demanding everyone pick a side, the ability to hold two truths at once is one of the most powerful things a person can possess. If this resonated with you, if you felt seen somewhere in this conversation, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what part of the Xennial experience hit closest to home. And if you want to keep exploring the psychology of who we are and why we became that way, subscribe, because there's always more to understand, and we're just getting started.